Hello, everyone. It is April 15th, 2022, which means it's the 75th, the diamond anniversary of Jackie Robinson desegregating Major League Baseball. I thought I'd hop on for a second, offer a couple of factual tidbits you may or may not be aware of. It's such a momentous occasion. I really wanted to do it big today. I had grand plans of being at an MLB game, but alas, that wasn't supposed to be. So I'm here presenting this to you in this way as my way of honoring Mr. Robinson. So, first, Jackie Robinson was not actually the first black to desegregate Major League Baseball. That privilege or honor actually goes to Moses Fleetwood Walker. He desegregated what is regarded as Major League Baseball in 1884. This is not Major League Baseball in the way that we know it in 2022. The National League or Major League Baseball is regarded as having been started in 1876. But at the time, it was an amalgamation of leagues throughout the country, and that was considered the major leagues. And Moses Fleetwood Walker was considered the first to have played. Again, he played in 1884. Second, let's talk about Jackie Robinson a bit. He's known as this great baseball player, but he actually lettered in four sports at UCLA. He lettered in baseball, basketball, football, and track. He played football alongside Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. And what's important about both of these gentlemen, Kenny Washington in particular, is that he desegregated the National Football League in 1946, if I'm not mistaken, by being signed by the Los Angeles Rams. We talk a lot about Jackie Robinson, and a lot about him is reduced to April 15th, 1947. But to understand Mr. Robinson, you have to take kind of the totality of his life and his experiences into account. And he served in the military. He was a veteran by the time he took the field on that day in April of 1947. He had served in the military for a couple of years during World War II, and in fact was court-martialed after an incident on a bus in which he was, although buses were not to be segregated at that, military buses were not to be segregated at that time, he was being instructed to go to the back of the bus. He refused, and as a result of the back and forth that went between him and the officer, that went on between him and the officer who was demanding that he move back, he was ultimately court-martialed, but fortunately acquitted. You know, as I was looking it up today, my next point relates to this. As I was looking it up today, the number one song in the country on April 15th, 1947, was a song called Heartaches by Ted Weems. And if you've seen my story on Facebook or IG today, you'll hear some audio for that song. Heartaches. It's an interesting song to have been number one on the day that Mr. Robinson made history. Branch Rickey, who was the president and general manager for the Brooklyn Dodgers, had in mind seeking a black player to elevate and bring up to the major leagues. But he specifically sought out a player who would not strike back in the face of racism, and ultimately decided that Jackie Robinson was the best guy for the job. And so it meant that Mr. Robinson tacitly agreed to, at the beginning of this experiment, agreed to tolerate a lot of racism and not respond to it. To no one's surprise, when he became a member of Major League Baseball, he endured racial epithets. He endured attempts to harm him on the field while in play. He endured the threat of teams boycotting playing any team that was desegregated. And he had already agreed to remain silent and not retaliate against such measures. So when I think about that song, Heartache, I think about the heartache that Mr. Robinson must have endured to have agreed on the front end to suppress any reaction that he might have had to some fairly abominable circumstances. After baseball, has a celebrated career, and he goes on to become the first black vice president of a major American corporation chock full of nuts. And this is where we get into more the tragedy of Jackie Robinson that's not discussed. He dies in 1972, just 9 days after having thrown out the first pitch of Game Two of the World Series that year. He dies of heart disease and diabetes. In fact, by the time he died, in the years preceding his death, he was fully blind in one eye and partially blind in another because of his diabetes. So this was an unwell man. When he dies, Jackie Robinson uh, looks more to be a man in his 70s rather than in his 50s. We don't talk enough about what the physical impact must have been on his health to have endured what he endured in the way of racism and hatred for decades. We don't talk about it enough, but it's no doubt that those things manifested themselves in him. We know physically, and it's hard to imagine that there wasn't an emotional or mental toll that all those things took on him. And finally, let's talk about his legacy a little bit. He dies 9 days after throwing out that first pitch, that pitch that I mentioned in Game Two of the World Series in 1972. And in that speech, the last public speech he makes, he references the fact that he looks forward to the day when he can look at third base and see a black manager. That doesn't become reality until another 2 years in 1974 when Frank Robinson becomes the first black manager. Now, the tragedy is that since then, there have only been, if I'm not mistaken, 16 black men who have served as managers of Major League Baseball teams. As we sit here today on April 15th, 2022, there are only two black managers in Major League Baseball, ironically enough, one of them being with now the LA Dodgers. So I wanted to take a little time today to find a way to honor Mr. Robinson in a way that was meaningful for me. I hope I've done that. I hope you've learned something you might not have known about Mr. Robinson. He's much more than the man that stood in Ebbets Field that day on April 15th, 1947. I hope this was helpful for you, and I'll see you next time.